Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of True Crime Finland, Aino Nykopp-Koski. As the title already suggests, this is a true crime podcast, and it details cases that can be disturbing and violent. Because of this, I encourage you to use your discretion and stop listening or skip ahead if you need to. If you're ready, let's get started with today's case. In the spring of 2009, an 80-year-old elderly woman is rushed to Maria's hospital in Helsinki in critical condition. She is treated in the emergency room, having life-threatening symptoms. Eventually, the woman gets better and regains consciousness. That's when she hears the allegations that were made of her. She was reported to be suicidal and had taken medicine intentionally to kill herself. The woman strongly, even angrily, denies these claims and instead makes an allegation of her own. She tells the doctor who is taking care of her that she has not taken the medicine herself and that she's definitely not suicidal. She also tells the doctor that actually she was poisoned, and even names the poisoner, the practical nurse responsible for the woman's home care. She explains to the doctor how the nurse had come to her home uninvited and served her yogurt that tasted very bitter. After eating some of the yogurt, the woman started feeling very ill, lost consciousness, and ended up at the hospital. The doctor believes the woman and calls the police immediately. The woman's blood is then tested and analyzed. Traces of large doses of drugs that were not and never had been on her medication were found. It turns out that the allegations of the woman being suicidal were made by her nurse, who had also originally called the ambulance and told the paramedics that the woman was an alcoholic, a drug abuser, and depressed. 3 days earlier, the elderly woman had sent her friend, a woman who lived in another city, a letter in which she criticized the same nurse taking care of her. She gave the letter to the nurse, asking her to mail it, but in the end, the friend never got the letter. The police entered the elderly woman's home and indeed found a plate with leftover yogurt on it. The plate and the yogurt itself were tested, and traces of the drugs that were found in the woman's blood were also found in the yogurt. The practical nurse, Aino Nykopp-Koski, at the time 59 years old, was soon captured and arrested. The police issued a warrant to search Nykopp's workplace and her home. In her locker at work, they found her work clothes and in the pockets of her pants, a large mix of loose and random pills, the same drugs that were found on the yogurt plate and in the elderly woman's blood. In Nykopp's home, they also found a large amount of jewelry, but Nykopp explained these to be gifts. The police started to investigate cases where patients had died while Aino Nykopp had been responsible for their home care. Soon enough, they discovered a case where an elderly person had deceased under Nykopp's care. At the same time, another case was being investigated where the family of a deceased elderly person had started to get suspicious of Nykopp's actions after the sudden death of their family member. A few months earlier, another suspicious death had occurred at Nykopp's workplace, where she had been the latest caretaker of a 77-year-old woman. The woman was in poor health but very stable, yet her condition worsened dramatically twice over a very short period of time, and eventually she passed away. No clear explanation was ever found for the sudden breakdown and death, until her body was exhumed for re-examination. An autopsy was performed, and drugs that were not a part of the woman's medication were found in her system. The police started looking at 112 calls and the numbers they were made from, and they came up with an entire list of calls made by Nykopp. There was a clear pattern. Nykopp would call the ambulance from the elderly person's home after they had lost consciousness and claimed that she had found them in that state and that the victim was suffering from a memory disorder and had trouble with alcohol and/or drugs. These first suspicions police had were all coming from Nykopp's workplace, but as the pressing question became, how many victims, the police started taking a closer look into Nykopp's past. Aino Nykopp-Koski had worked as a practical nurse in multiple different hospitals, nursing homes, institutions, and also as an independent entrepreneur ever since the 80s. She was regarded as trustworthy, loyal, and a hard worker. Her employers liked her as she always showed up to work on time and was kind and caring. However, others also stated that a lot happened when she was around. Certain medical records, patients' property or valuables, and important papers frequently went missing. Then, in the mid-2000s, weird incidents started to become more frequent. Elderly patients that were originally very stable and healthy came into the hospital for an operation, for example, and then they would suddenly lose consciousness and have dangerous seizures. While this was going on, the patient's money, jewelry, or valuables would go missing. There was an incident where a war widow's only souvenir of her late husband was a golden ring that she always wore on her finger. When she arrived to the hospital, the rules required her to take it off, and later on the ring had suspiciously disappeared. In 2005, Nykopp was working in a private hospital where the same type of weird incidents kept happening. Some patients' property and medicine from the hospital, among other things, had started to go missing, and Nykopp was under scrutiny. At the same time, Nykopp's co-worker was suffering from life-threatening symptoms after drinking coffee. Before this incident, Nykopp and the co-worker had been working the same shift, and the co-worker had been asked to keep an eye on Nykopp because of the recent suspicions. In addition to this, a 70-year-old man who was a bed patient and very ill had died under mysterious circumstances. In July of the same year, Nykopp got caught of stealing and her locker was searched. An enormous amount of drugs that affect the central nervous system were discovered among an empty soda bottle, where drugs that were either going out of use because of the date on them or because they had dropped onto the floor were found. Substances that the human system produces on its own were also in the locker, and it's impossible to know if these drugs were ever given to anyone, as they would be hard to detect. The police conducted a preliminary investigation, and enough cause was determined to arrest Nykopp. Later on, she was convicted of a drug offense and a theft, and her contract with the private hospital was exterminated. However, after this verdict, Nykopp moved on to work for other employers. How she was able to continue working as a nurse is anyone's guess. In 2006, Nykopp gave an 80-year-old man psychoactive drugs. The man suffered a seizure and went into a life-threatening state, but luckily he survived. Nykopp blamed the man's wife of giving the man sleeping pills. During the same year, Nykopp also poisoned another woman who passed away and then blamed her husband of giving the woman his own medicine. All of this was a lie that Nykopp fabricated to drive the suspicions away from her. In addition, during the same year, 1 other man and 3 other women were poisoned, but they all survived. The next year, in 2007, Nykopp poisoned a 75-year-old woman, a home care patient who was immobile and had to be in a wheelchair. Nykopp had given her the same psychoactive drugs, but the woman survived. In the beginning of 2008, a 90-year-old woman passed away under Nykopp's care. Nykopp had given her a large dose of the same psychoactive drugs, not once, but twice. On the 25th of February, the woman had to be admitted to the hospital for a few hours, and that's presumably when the first dose was given to her. Then the next day, more drugs had been put into her system. She was able to go back home, but kept falling over many times until she passed away on the 8th of March. Some of her property and valuables had been stolen. In the autumn of the same year, Nykopp poisoned a 77-year-old woman whom she had given the same drugs. Nykopp had offered her services in a local newspaper, and this is how she came to be the woman's home care nurse. In this case, Nykopp herself had called 112 and suspected a drug overdose. The woman was taken to the hospital and survived, but some of her valuables, for example a golden cross necklace and some brand items, had disappeared while she was away. Now, back to 2009. The police had compiled a list of every single suspicious incident or death Nykopp had been involved in, one way or another. They brought the list to Erkki Vuori, a renowned professor emeritus in forensic chemistry. Vuori immediately recognized the very first case on the list, a suspicious death that had occurred in 2004 under unclear circumstances. An 81-year-old woman had not been able to have a heart surgery under public health care, so she had sought out a private hospital in Helsinki to go through with the surgery. The procedure had been a success, and even though the woman spent 24 hours in intensive care, she was doing well and was quickly transferred to a normal ward. There, her nurse was assigned to be Aino Nykopp. Everything seemed to be going well when suddenly Aino raised an alarm stating that she needs a resuscitator to arrive immediately. The woman was in critical condition. She was being resuscitated for hours, but she ended up passing away. A forensic autopsy was performed as the woman had died after the procedure was done, but nothing alluding to a failed surgery was ever found. By all accounts, the surgery had been a big success, and seemingly no complications had occurred. Toxicology tests were also performed, and unusually high doses of 2 different drugs were found in the woman's system. The surgeons and the resuscitators were questioned about these drugs, but all of them made it very clear, quickly and sternly, that this kind of medicine was never even used by them. A bit of an uproar arose over the situation, and new tests were performed. However, the same results came back now for the second time. These results could not be explained, and at the time, no one could even suspect foul play. Once Erkki Vuori saw the list of cases, and this one as the very first, he knew exactly what had happened. As the list of victims only grew, even the police were shocked to find out about the nature of the crimes. On the list, there were cases where the doctor had written a death certificate, but pieces of some organs were preserved during the autopsy for later research. Among these cases were victims who had also died under suspicious circumstances, but that had already been cremated. The ashes could not be examined, but these victims also had pieces preserved from their organs during the autopsy, and so these samples could be looked at. The police seized all of the samples and tests were performed on them. The samples were mostly taken from the liver, and this kind of posthumous examination with this specific purpose had never before been done, neither in Finland nor elsewhere. The pieces of liver were grated into tiny flakes, and the forensic chemist developed a method to examine the flakes. Traces of drugs that were not included in the victim's medication were found, and so it was concluded that these victims were also poisoned. Another pattern was also soon established. All of the victims had symptoms of either cerebral hemorrhage, Alzheimer's disease, or problems in their cerebral blood circulation. Nykopp often used benzodiazepines, psychoactive drugs that would cause apnea and breathing difficulties, among other symptoms. The diseases I mentioned before also inflict the same type of symptoms, so the poisoning imitates the disease. Because of this, it was easy for Nykopp to trick paramedics and doctors that arrived on the scene to help. But it's impossible to know if Nykopp chose her victims based on these specific diseases or symptoms. On the 14th of May in 2010, the Helsinki District Court made a ruling according to which Nykopp was charged with 5 counts of murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault, among other charges like thefts. Nykopp requested to be let out of pre-trial detention and to be moved to Vantaa prison or to Hämeenlinna Women's Prison, but the court denied these claims. Afterwards, a psychiatric examination was performed and it was determined that Nykopp was capable of standing trial and that she understood right from wrong. It was also determined that she suffered from an antisocial personality disorder that included multiple psychopathic traits. She was very skilled in manipulating other people and taking advantage of them, and she had a very strong tendency to lie. Some of the problems she had regarding her emotional life had already been discovered in her youth. Usually the results of psychiatric examinations are not revealed, but this time the court ruled that since the case is very unusual and because it is related to public and private healthcare, the publication of the results helps reassess the reliability of healthcare in Finland. I want to quickly clarify here that Finland does not have a jury system. The ruling in district court is made by 3 judges, 2 of whom are normal citizens, and this is the closest equivalent we have to a jury. Also, there is no death penalty, and life in prison is on average 14 years. The prison system focuses more on rehabilitation and helping the prisoners to become contributing members of society again. Nykopp was tried in Helsinki District Court, and she pleaded not guilty. She claimed that in some cases the death was natural, and in others the patients themselves had taken too much medicine. She also claimed that some of the drugs found in her possession were meant to be destroyed and that she herself used some to help her sleeping problems and anxiety. She blamed the police for losing the patient's original recipes while they were going through all the medicines she had. About the valuables found in her possession, she said that some of the items were given to her in order for her to look after them, and that the rest of them were gifts. Nykopp completely denied the murders and has stated multiple times that she has only ever wanted to help, and that soon it won't be possible to work in the industry anymore if one has to keep being afraid of being charged when the only goal is wanting to help. Apparently, she also stated that she's disappointed that nursing is not appreciated in Finland. Nykopp gave multiple interviews declaring her innocence, even giving one to a talk show. She also gave one to YLE, and I will translate some of it here and then post a link to the entirety of it in the show notes for my listeners who understand Finnish. The interviewer asks, quote, "What are the main reasons why you see that it is worth it to appeal to the Helsinki Court of Appeals?" End of quote. Nykopp answers, quote, "Well, we have really been going through these things carefully, and indeed there are people who have spoken over me, and so much has been discovered that I'm very hopeful that the reason why I'm being accused will be discovered." End of quote. The interviewer asks, quote, "In court, even your lawyer said that in this case, the evidence is so strong that it is also possible that there will be a sentence. What does this mean? Why did he say this? Do you agree with him?" End of quote. Nykopp answers, quote, "Yeah, I mean, the things that have been turned in, the evidence and all this, I do agree with him. But when you think of it, a lawyer, he can't possibly know the basics of medicine, the things that a nurse, for example, would know, and we talked less about those things back then. Even I myself was not paying attention to that then. So yes, it's kind of my bad that I just did not believe it at all, and I didn't familiarize myself enough with these things." End of quote. The interviewer asks, quote, "In light of all of this evidence that has been presented in court, on what basis should people still believe you are innocent?" End of quote. Nykopp answers, quote, "Not on any basis. I could not, honestly, I cannot imagine that someone would do that. But then, when this new evidence will surface, then the citizens could start thinking if all of this is actually even true at all at the end of the day." End of quote. Then, the interviewer describes the personality disorder that the professionals found Nykopp to be suffering from, and then asks what it sounds like to her. Nykopp answers with a slight smile on her face, quote, "Well, it's pretty horrible, is it not? A person can't act nicely, so I mean, I'm thinking that are all the well-behaved nurses and people then like this, that they have a personality disorder, or they are psychopaths, or whatever. It is a bit strange." End of quote. Lastly, the interviewer asks, quote, "What do you think the families of the victims think of you?" End of quote. Nykopp answers, quote, "Well, probably that I'm a terrible person, or I think that honestly, they are thinking, at least deep down, they are doubting if it's actually even true. But probably they too are completely lost, not being able to tell what is true and what is false." End of quote. Nykopp was sentenced to life in prison. She appealed to the Helsinki Court of Appeals, but they upheld her sentence and ruled in March of 2012 that she was guilty of 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 3 counts of aggravated assault, 4 counts of theft, and 2 counts of drug possession. The Court of Appeals also stated that Nykopp committed the murders and attempted murders with consideration when giving the drugs to defenseless patients in secret, and that she also took advantage of the trust that was formed between her and the patient. These factors made the crimes even more heinous, according to the court. Nykopp tried to appeal her sentence further, but the Supreme Court of Finland dismissed her appeal in November of 2012. It is still not clear what Nykopp's motive was. However, international research has shown that when healthcare professionals commit crimes, they often want to show that they are irreplaceable and powerful by poisoning and eventually saving the victim. Sometimes the motive is also financial, but in this case that was difficult to prove as Nykopp did not really gain any profit. No wills nor life insurances were involved, only valuables and jewelry that she stole from the patients. Research has also shown that among the crimes committed by healthcare professionals, the ones that can be proven represent only less than 20% of all the crimes they have committed in reality. The crimes Nykopp was charged with were most likely not the only ones she has ever committed, but we will never be able to say for sure how many more victims there really are. Yet another sad aspect of this case is how Nykopp was able to continue working as a nurse even after she was charged with theft and drug possession, and how she was not suspected to be involved in the unclear deaths of patients that had been occurring at the time already. There is a government agency called Valvira, the National Supervisory Authority for Welfare and Health, that operates under the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, and supervises and offers guidance to healthcare and social services providers and professionals, among other things. The emphasis here is on the word supervises. Valvira receives and handles notifications about situations where patient safety is at risk. The courts have an obligation to notify Valvira when a healthcare professional is charged and sentenced with a crime that has occurred while they were practicing. The police and other people, employers, and even private persons also have a right to notify Valvira before the crime is committed, but the courts are required to. Valvira has stated that they did not know that Nykopp was charged and sentenced because the courts had not notified them. As the evidence concerning the crimes committed was somewhat unclear when the suspicions first came out, it was simply decided that Nykopp will be moved from one unit to another and that her duties would change. However, because of this, clearing up issues became increasingly difficult as the information needed was spread out over many units and hospitals. According to Valvira, they tried to get involved, but the nurse herself made this difficult. Valvira came to the conclusion that the chief security officer was left alone with the case, and there was not enough cooperation that would cross all borders and units. The issue was tried to be solved too quickly so that Nykopp only ended up becoming a negative challenge trophy that was recycled every time a problem occurred. When Nykopp was caught stealing in 2005, her employer at the time quickly made a background check and reported her. She had also suspected Nykopp of stealing money, but she was never charged with this, and the elderly patients did not remember what had happened when the police questioned them about the incidents a year afterwards. Nykopp was fired, and the employer says that she warned Valvira among other supervisory authorities, but the issues were never approached. Another problem was that previous victims had been telling nurses and doctors about the problems they had faced with Nykopp, but their allegations were not taken seriously as the other nurses and doctors suspected they might have problems with their memory. When a healthcare professional gives out background information, it is always assumed that what they are saying is true, even though the patients themselves strongly claimed they were not suicidal nor substance abusers, nor did they suffer from depression. Nykopp's word counted more against theirs, even though the elderly patients were still very in touch with reality and realized what was happening. Aino Nykopp-Koski is the first female serial killer ever caught in Finland, and she is currently serving time in Hämeenlinna prison. She is now married to another prisoner who is significantly younger than her. Thank you so much for listening to the second episode of True Crime Finland, crime stories from the cold north. Art is by Mark Pernia. You can email him at markprn@mail.com. That's markprn@mail.com. Music is Night by VVSMUSIC. If you have any questions, suggestions for future episodes, or anything at all you would like to tell me, you can contact me via email at truecrimefinlandpod@gmail.com. I also have a Facebook group called True Crime Finland Podcast, and I accept everyone. The next episode will hopefully come out in 2 weeks. Stay tuned. You can find me on my website at truecrimefinland.squarespace.com and on Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, or wherever you get your podcasts.